Wind hisses across a bare moor. A thin path cuts the heather like a scar. Across England lie roads not made for the living, tracks walked only once by those who would never return. They are the corpse roads, lines of power, profit, and fear, where the church claimed the dead, and the dead sometimes claim the night. Tonight, the 1260 Dartmoor petition against a 12 to 17-mile funeral trek, the blue corpse candles that map a burial before anyone dies, and the legal battles on ancient paths that helped shape England's right to roam. This is the Candlelight Historian, where we walk the threshold between history and haunting, bringing the quiet lives of ordinary people back into the light. Section 1. Origins, Theology, Power, and Money. To understand these strange and solemn paths, we must first understand a world where the final journey of the body was inseparable from the eternal fate of the soul. In medieval England, after the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the Christian Church established an absolute authority over death. At its heart was a doctrine that could not be negotiated. For a soul to find salvation, to shorten its agonizing passage through purgatory, the body had to be laid to rest in consecrated ground. This spiritual imperative was enforced through the parish system. Huge, ancient mother churches or minsters were the ecclesiastical centers of power, holding the exclusive right to bury every parishioner within their vast territories. A remote hamlet might build a small chapel of ease for local worship, but the right to bury its own dead was a privilege rarely granted. This was not just theology, it was control. As populations grew and settlements pushed further into the wild fells and dales, these communities developed their own identities. The mother churches, sensing a threat to their authority, reinforced their monopoly on burial. By forcing the living to carry their dead back to the center, sometimes for days, the church continually reasserted its power. Every funeral procession that trudged across the landscape was a physical reaffirmation of this hierarchy. The corpse road was a tether, a line of ecclesiastical control binding the periphery to the core. And where there is power, there is profit. The church's monopoly was not just spiritual, it was financial. Churches charged fees for the funeral service and for the burial plot itself. More than that, they were legally entitled to mortuary dues, a kind of death duty owed to the priest. To grant a local chapel burial rites was to give away a reliable and significant stream of income. So the system remained rigid. The corpse road was the route along which this revenue flowed, from the farthest corners of the parish back to the center. This created what historians call a landscape of obligation. As settlements expanded into the high fells of Cumbria, the secluded dales of Yorkshire, and the vast moors of Devon, canon law did not adapt. The rule was absolute. A parishioner must be buried at their mother church, no matter the distance, no matter the danger. Imagine it, a death in a remote farmstead in the heart of winter. The journey ahead is not a few miles, but 10, 12, even 16 miles on foot, over brutal terrain. The body, perhaps wrapped only in a shroud, is carried on a simple wooden frame called a bier. It is a communal act of piety and endurance, a solemn duty from which there was no escape. This was the genesis of the corpse road, a path born of faith, power, and money. Section 2. Etching the Land. How corpse roads looked. Corpse roads were not grand engineered highways. They were what are known as vernacular routeways, existing tracks, drovers' roads, or simple paths between settlements that were adopted for a solemn purpose. They were etched into the land by the repeated footfalls of mourners. Often, They were deliberately routed to avoid passing directly through villages or past the front doors of cottages. The sight of a funeral procession was considered an ill omen, and no one wanted the dead carried past their home. In farming country, the path might take the form of a beer balk, a narrow strip at the edge of a field, intentionally left unplowed. This was partly practical, but it was also rooted in a belief, a piece of folklore, that a field crossed by a coffin would become barren, its fertility blighted by the passage of death. The destination of every corpse road was the churchyard, and its formal entrance was the Lychgate. The name comes from the Old English word meaning body or corpse. This was more than a gate. It was a threshold, a sheltered space, marking the boundary between the profane world and the consecrated ground. Here, the procession would halt. The coffin would be placed on a large, flat stone slab known as a lychstone, or on benches, while the mourners waited for the priest to begin the burial service. This liminal space accumulated its own folklore. A persistent belief, recorded in Cheshire and Shropshire, held that the spirit of the last person buried stood a lonely vigil at the gate, guarding it until the next soul arrived to relieve them. This could lead to documented, unseemly races between funeral parties, each desperate that their loved one not be burdened with the watch. The journey itself was physically punishing. To manage the immense weight of the body, the paths were punctuated by resting places. The most characteristic are these: coffin stones, or coffin rests. You can still see fine examples on the 16-mile Swaledale Corpse Way in Yorkshire, and on the path from Rydal to Ambleside in the Lake District. These stones served a vital practical purpose for the pallbearers, who often worked in shifts, but they were also governed by strict supernatural protocol. It was a widely held belief that the coffin must never be placed directly on the bare earth before reaching the churchyard. To do so was to risk the spirit of the deceased escaping the coffin and wandering off, becoming a lost and potentially malevolent soul. The coffin stone was a safe, neutral platform, allowing the living to rest without endangering the spiritual passage of the dead. Finally, the landscape itself dictated the architecture of the route. Water crossings were unavoidable. Special coffin bridges were sometimes built wide enough for bearers to walk abreast. On Dartmoor's famous Lich Way, processions had to navigate ancient clapper bridges, primitive but effective structures of massive granite slabs. Where there were no bridges, they used fords. As we will see, these water crossings were far more than just physical obstacles. In the invisible geography of the corpse road, they were powerful spiritual boundaries. Section 3, Invisible Geography, Folklore and Supernatural Protocol. The physical path was only half the story. Corpse roads ran not just through the physical countryside, but through what one historian calls the invisible geography of the pre-industrial mind, a landscape of belief, ritual, and fear. These were not just tracks for bodies, they were conduits for spirits, where the veil between worlds was perilously thin. This idea was so common that it appears matter-of-factly in Shakespeare. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, the sprite Puck announces the witching hour. Shakespeare's churchway paths are corpse roads. His casual reference shows that his audience understood this concept perfectly. These paths were highways for ghosts, used by the dead themselves to glide between the grave and the world of mortals. Perhaps the most vivid folklore associated with these paths is the corpse candle. These were mysterious spectral lights, often described as small blue flames seen floating along the exact route a future funeral would take. The belief was that the night before a death, the person's spirit would pre-trace its final journey. The light would appear at their house, travel the corpse road, and vanish into the ground at the very spot where the grave would be dug. This tradition was especially strong in Wales, where it was said to be a promise from the patron saint, Saint David, that his people would always receive a supernatural warning before death. The folklore was incredibly specific. A large, bright light foretold the death of a man, a smaller red one, an elderly woman. A small blue flame was almost universally believed to be the omen for the death of a child. A fascinating paradox existed in the beliefs about the path's alignment. One ancient tradition held that spirits could only travel in straight lines. Therefore, a corpse road had to be as straight as possible, running directly over hills and through valleys to ensure the soul followed the body to the grave. This idea has a deep resonance. Archaeologists have noted its similarity to Neolithic cursuses, massive ancient earthworks that run in remarkably straight lines for miles, connecting burial mounds. It's possible the medieval belief was a folk memory of a much older, pre-Christian sacred geography. But a competing tradition, based on the very same premise, drew the opposite conclusion. If spirits travel in straight lines, the best way to stop a ghost from finding its way back home to haunt the living was to take it on a deliberately winding, meandering route. This would confuse the spirit, making it impossible for it to retrace its steps. This tension between the straight path to guide the soul and the crooked path to foil it reveals the central anxieties of the journey. The journey was a performance of what we might call spiritual hygiene, a set of apotropaic or evil-averting rituals to contain the dead. The most common rule was that the corpse must always be carried feet first, pointing away from home and towards the church. This was to prevent the spirit from seeing its way back. It's the origin of the enduring phrase, "I'll only leave this house feet first." In some regions, the coffin was taken out through a window or a specially breached wall, and the chairs it had rested on were upturned, all to break the spirit's connection to the home. A near-universal belief in British folklore held that spirits could not cross running water. A water crossing on a corpse road was therefore a ritual necessity, severing the ghost's connection to its former life and trapping it on the churchyard side of the river. If water was a barrier, the crossroads was a vortex, a dangerous place where the physical and spirit worlds intersected. Processions would hurry across them, sometimes protected by a wayside cross, erected to ward off evil. In some places, charms like witch balls, glass spheres containing tangled threads, were hung along the route to ensnare any passing malice. Every step of the journey was a carefully managed ritual, designed to get the dead to their final rest and ensure they stayed there. Section 4. Phantoms, Fairies, and Tainted Earth. With such a constant traffic of death and grief, it's no surprise that corpse roads became stages for the supernatural. Tales of phantom funeral processions were common, with witnesses reporting silent, spectral corteges moving along the paths at night, sometimes accompanied by the ghosts of monks chanting unheard dirges. These stories reinforced the road's reputation as places trodden by spirits long after their bodies were in the grave. But the folklore goes deeper, connecting to a much older, pre-Christian world. One of the most intriguing beliefs is that these paths were also used by the fairy folk. In authentic British folklore, fairies were not tiny, benevolent sprites, but powerful, amoral, and often dangerous beings, closely associated with the ancient dead and the underworld. Tales of faerie funerals, or the faerie host marching to battle, are found along many corpse roads. In Ireland, it was considered a grave offense to build a house that obstructed one of these ancient paths, as it would invite faerie wrath. This suggests that Christian funeral rites were often mapped onto a pre-existing network of sacred ways, ancient spirit paths that connected the world of the living to the other world. The Church simply provided a new purpose for this ancient ritual landscape. The faerie steps on the Corpse Road from Arnside to Beetham in Cumbria are a living testament to this fusion of beliefs. The passage of the dead was believed to leave a permanent mark on the land itself. But one belief had very real social consequences. This was the persistent piece of folklore that any route over which a coffin was carried automatically became a public right of way. Though it has no basis in actual English law, the idea was so powerful that, well into the 19th century, landowners, fearing the creation of a permanent public path across their estates, would erect signs explicitly forbidding funeral processions. This forced mourners onto longer routes and created conflict between commoners and the gentry, a conflict that would later fuel the fight for public access to the countryside. Section 5. Regional Case Studies. While the folklore was widespread, the character of each corpse road was shaped by its unique landscape. Of all England's corpse roads, few are as famous as the Lychway of Dartmoor. Its story is anchored in a rare historical document. In the 13th century, the vast forest of Dartmoor was in the parish of Lidford. By 1260, the inhabitants of the remote farmsteads had reached their breaking point. They petitioned the Bishop of Exeter, Walter Bronscombe, complaining of the journey to bury their dead. Their petition, a direct voice from the past, stated the trek was 12 Devon miles, about 17 modern miles, in fine weather, and about 15 or 22 modern miles by a roundabout journey in times of storms. The bishop granted their request to use the closer church at Widecombe, but the Lychway continued to be used by newer farms for centuries. The route crosses the rivers West Dart, Cowsick, Walkham and Tarvey over treacherous fords and ancient clapper bridges. It passes landmarks like Coffin Wood, and in places the path is still visible as a sunken track, a holloway, with the ruts of coffin carts discernible in the earth. While the main historical ghost story is a general one of phantom monks, the path's eerie reputation is bolstered by chilling modern accounts. During the 1980s, a woman on a night drive nearly crashed when she swerved to avoid a coffin placed in the road on the path of the old Lychway. Another witness, walking the path near a set of stepping stones, reported being knocked backwards after walking into a line of tall black shadows that then moved silently away across the field. In the Lake District, the severe landscape bred its own dramatic legends. The most poignant comes from the Old Corpse Road between Wasdale Head and St. Catherine's Church in Eskdale. As the story is told, a funeral procession was transporting a young man's body on a pony. Suddenly, the pony bolted, vanishing into the mist with its tragic burden. Months later, the young man's mother, having died of grief, was being carried along the same path. At the very same spot, her pony also bolted. This time, the search party found a coffin, but it was her son's, miraculously recovered. He was finally buried, but his mother's body was never found. Local lore says her ghost, sometimes tied to a spectral horse, still haunts the path, forever searching for her own final rest. On the Corpse Road from Arnside to Beetham, the challenge was geological. The path ascends a limestone cliff through an extremely narrow fissure known as the faerie steps. It was impossible to carry a coffin through it. Instead, the party had to haul the coffin up and over the crag using ropes and a system of iron rings embedded in the rock. In the 19th century, these Cumbrian paths became battlegrounds. In 1886, on the road from Borrowdale to Crosswaite, a landowner tried to block the path. The fight was taken up by the formidable Reverend Hardwick Rawnsley, a man who would co-found the National Trust. He organized a mass protest, and hundreds of locals marched to tear down the barriers. A similar legal battle was won at Urton in 1899. These documented fights mark a crucial shift in the meaning of the Corpse Road, from a path of sacred obligation to a symbol of the public's right to the landscape. The Yorkshire Dales are home to some of the best preserved corpse roads. The Swaledale Corpse Way runs for 16 miles from the hamlet of Keld to the Mother Church at Grinton. Its route is still marked by monumental coffin stones. One stone near Ivelet Bridge is the focus of a local legend. It is said to be haunted by the ghost of a headless black dog. On Danby Rig, in the North York Moors, a path running across the Fairy Cross Plain, past prehistoric cairns and the mysterious Old Wife Stones, was known locally by a more direct name, the Old Hell Road. But perhaps the most vivid account comes not from folklore, but from an 1871 eyewitness description of a funeral from Redcar to Marske. The ritual began with a public breakfast. The coffin was then slung upon towels knotted together and borne by relays of men. At a resting place, a specific rite was performed. The coffin was bumped upon a heap of stones 3 times. The mourners then sang a hymn, the lamentation of a sinner, before continuing. As they entered the churchyard, every man, woman, and child present received a dole of 6pence. This documented account reveals the journey not just as a supernatural ordeal, but as a piece of social theater, a structured public performance of grief and community. Section 6. Wider World and Survival. The Corpse Road was not a uniquely English phenomenon. Similar paths and traditions existed across the British Isles and Europe, born of the same medieval church structure. In Scotland, the journey was preceded by the Lyke Wake, a vigil that could become a famously raucous, whiskey-fueled affair. On the path, mourners would add a stone to resting cairns as a memorial, and women, often excluded from the full procession, would follow for a time to sing the Coronach, a traditional Gaelic lament. In Wales, while many traditions were shared with England, the folklore was dominated by the Canwyll Corph, the corpse candle, as a central, codified belief. In Ireland, the folkloric focus was intensely on the wake inside the home, with a complex set of rituals, stopping clocks, covering mirrors, and opening windows to allow the soul to depart freely. Across continental Europe, the echoes are clear. In Germany, they were known as Totenwege, death roads, or Geisterwege, ghost roads. In the Netherlands, Doodwegen. In France, the Chemin des Morts. The widespread existence of these paths underscores a shared medieval problem, and the similar anxieties about revenants, the returning dead, that it produced. The use of these paths began to decline from the 17th century. The Mother Church's monopoly was gradually broken as more rural parishes successfully petitioned to consecrate their own churchyards. The Enclosure Acts of the 18th and 19th centuries physically obstructed many ancient routes with new walls and fences. And finally, the arrival of better roads and wheeled hearses made the arduous journey by foot obsolete. But many of these paths survive. They persist as public footpaths and bridleways, their original purpose forgotten by most. A section of the Pennine Way follows the historic Corpse Road over Cross Fell. In the North York Moors, the famous Wake Walk, a 40-mile challenge hike, was explicitly created to commemorate the ancient coffin routes. Today, organizations like the National Trust and Forestry England maintain and promote these trails, inviting us to connect with the history of the landscape. They have become objects of local history and the growing phenomenon of dark tourism, a curiosity about places associated with death and the macabre. Most walkers see a pretty track and a weathered stone, but when the fog presses close and the water runs black under the bridge, the past leans in. On England's corpse roads, the dead still borrow our path, if only for a moment. If you've trodden one of these ways, or your village keeps its own tale of a lychgate or a coffin stone, tell me in the comments. I read them all. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the Candlelight Historian, and tap the bell so you don't miss what's next. Thank you for watching and for keeping the candle lit.